DeWeese is a strange Marxist, candidate psychoanalyst, Lacanian, of course, the only true psychoanalysis, and an organizer with the South Carolina Progressive Network. So the epigraph to today's presentation is something that some of you heard yesterday from Jacques Lacan. Revolutionaries, what you aspire to is a master. You'll get one. Introduction. Long before Jordan Peterson decried the fall of the father and the deconstruction of the divine masculine by neo-Marxists, feminists, etc., the arbiters of that most conservative project, psychoanalysis, cautioned of the impending catastrophe in the wake of the paternal imago. Imago is a clinical term. It refers to an image imbued with emotion, libidinal attachment, etc. In 1900, Freud warned of the fall of the potestas patrias familias, power of the father. Some years later, Lacan described the ruin of the paternal imago as the principal causation for modern psychopathology. From Freud to Jordan Peterson, the collapse of the father as the symbolic mediator, or ordering principle for psychosocial stability, has remained an enduring grievance for conservatives. Ironically, it was Marx who would, in a way, commend capital for the abolition of patriarchal relations. Quote from Marx: "The bourgeoisie, wherever it has got the upper hand, has put an end to all feudal, patriarchal, idyllic relations. It has pitilessly torn asunder the motley feudal ties that bound man to his natural superiors, and has left remaining no other nexus between man and man than naked self-interest and callous cash payment." End quote. For Peterson, the father and his once eminent position, along with the remainder of Western civilization, is in retreat. The American psychoanalyst Bruce Fink describes the paternal retreat in detail, citing modifications in family structures in terms of rising single-parent households, divorce rates, structural changes in traditional gender roles, and anti-authoritarian child-rearing practices. If the father is in decline, then the fantasy, or rather the desire for the fantasy of Big Papa, or the primordial father, has returned with a vengeance. It was in Totem and Taboo that Freud first took up the notion of the primitive horde, proceeding from Darwin's theory as published in The Descent of Man, 1871. The Big Papa of psychoanalysis, Freud, writes, quote, "The strongest male was lord and father of the entire horde and unrestricted in his power, which he exercised with violence. All the females were his property. The lot of his sons was a hard one. If they roused their father's jealousy, they were killed or castrated or driven out. The first decisive step towards a change in this sort of social organization seems to have been that the expelled brothers living in a community united to overpower the father and devoured him raw, as was the custom in those days." Freud continues by noting the ambivalence that the gang of brothers felt towards the father. They both loved and hated him. Continuing with Freud, we can understand the cannibalistic act as an attempt to ensure identification with him by incorporating a piece of him. End quote. According to Freud, apropos the deed, capital D, this is what Freud articulates as the originary deed of mankind, the murder of Big Papa, and the subsequent incorporation of the dead father, the ego ideal functioning as moral law, so this would what would be called conscious, and its obscene underside, the superego, the critical aspect of conscious, was constituted. The absent dead father was immortalized in the unconscious through the interjection of a signifier, or to put it simply, through the internalization of an idea. Pursuant to the primordial murder of the father, the law is operationalized by the gang of brothers through the renunciation of the instinct. In other words, the renunciation for the desire of the mother as the object of desire. Freud thus remarks, "Thus was born the first form of social organization with the resulting institutions of exogamy, the incest taboo, totemism for the foundation of religious experience." So it's useful for our examination to provide 3 examples of how these phantasmatic coordinates involving the fraternal alliance and the dead father are still operative in social organizations, and in a particular theoretical orientation, psychoanalysis. The first example is provided by the French psychoanalyst Gérard Pommier in his seminar, "Is There a Falling of Patriarchal Power and What Are the Consequences?" There, Pommier suggests that the decline of the father began with the beginning of humanity and is repeated compulsively. The father was always already in decline. Pommier examines this repetition apropos 2 ideologies which constitute the topological inversion of the other. religious fundamentalism, and capitalism. So I'm going to summarize this very quickly because time is running. Perhaps you can argue with me later if you disagree. But with fundamentalism, we see a return or an attempt to return to traditional values under the sovereignty of the biggest papa of all, God, Allah, etc. With capitalism, and I'm drawing on, as is Pommier here, Max Weber, the spirit of the Protestant work ethic and spirit of capitalism. And so in this, Weber articulates the ferocity of the capitalist class is embodied by this notion of soteriology. How do you know if you're saved or not? Well, it's precisely if you receive a profitable rate of return. And so what Pommier suggests, there is still, within this Protestant work ethic, which allegedly gave birth to capitalism, there's still an unconscious allegiance to the dead father, which points to, if you receive a profitable rate of return, your favored position in the dominance hierarchy. So much for that. The last and perhaps most interesting example of the persistence/insistence of the fantasy of the primordial father is in psychoanalysis itself. The Oedipal drama was Freud's wishful dream, and ultimately his therapeutic endorsement of a neurotic's answer to an underlying problem. In Freud's clinic, in contradistinction to Freud's theory, we do not find strong, threatening fathers. Rather, we find weak, impotent, oftentimes ailing fathers. Consider Freud's most famous cases: the Rat Man, the Wolf Man, Dora, Little Hans, and so on and so forth. The Belgian psychoanalyst Paul Verhagen, again following Lacan, points that Freud's Oedipal theory is a measure to safeguard the position of the father. Quote from Verhagen: "The message that Freud passes to his analysants via his interpretations that they are anxious for their almighty father who forbids them access to their mother is precisely what they need. Through the myth of the primal horde, he endorses the typically neurotic solution, the authoritarian father, by elevating the solution to a supposed historical reality." End quote. A fundamental question arises: why did Freud's neurotic analysants need the solution? From the fundamentalists looking to resurrect the dead father to reinstall the law, to the Weberian capitalists looking for signs of salvation indicated by profitable rates of return, and finally the clinical example of weak fathers, all signs point to the impotency of the father, and hence the perpetual return for the fantasy of Big Papa, the primordial father. For traditionalists, paleoconservatives such as Peterson, both the father and the divine masculine are in decline. He and Western civilization are threatened to be consigned to oblivion. From this perspective, the current state of men can be accounted for by the above-mentioned decline. In a 28 interview with Rebel Wisdom, a men's self-help group based on Peterson's teachings, if anyone's familiar with this, for their documentary, Jordan Peterson, Truth in the Time of Chaos, Peterson was asked to summarize why does he think men are in crisis. He responded. Extended quote from Peterson: "I apologize, but I don't want to be accused of taking it up." Yeah. Quote, "I think it's because at a deep level, the West has lost faith in the idea of masculinity, and that's no different than the death of God. It's the same thing, and Nietzsche knew what the consequence of that would be. And so that's what he wrote about. So you would say that the divine symbol of masculinity has been obliterated. Well then, what do you expect? What's going to happen? That means masculinity is going to become weak, and especially if the symbol is denigrated. And it is denigrated. So I think the reason men have been responding positively to my thinking, let's say, is that I don't buy any of that. I think the masculine spirit is necessary. It's not fundamentally carnage and pillage and rape culture. Those are reasonable challenges to be set before men, but they are not reasonable accusations to swallow without criticism," end quote. So one should note that Peterson assumes Nietzsche's insight, and Marx, as is quoted earlier, that a fundamental ordering principle for Western society, namely God or Big Papa, has been torn asunder. At a certain level, Peterson is correct. However, he's mistaken about the culprit. More on that later. So Peterson recognizes the destabilization of meanings, i.e. the crisis of men, as a reasonable challenge, and posits the rebirth of the logos as the appropriate reaction to the deadlock of modernity. He proceeds to define his solution of the rebirth of the logos as, quote, "Part of it," we've all heard this, "part of it is taking responsibility for the appalling conditions of your life. So the rebirth of the logos, as far as I'm concerned, is the willingness to take responsibility for the shaping of destiny. That's it. This seemingly innocuous prescription concerning the voluntary acceptance of responsibility in order to attenuate the suffering of the individual exposes a reactionary narrative when cross-referenced with Peterson's social critique of the condition of the West. At an event entitled Freedom of Speech/Political Correctness, he identifies the culprit intent upon the destruction of Western values and the masculine spirit as a, quote, postmodernism nested inside a deeper Marxism. So when the postmodern narrative doesn't suffice, say to push forward the idea that Western civilization should be overturned, they just revert back to the overarching Marxism and say those people are oppressed and that's a bad thing, end quote. At the same event, Peterson elaborated on what he identifies as a problem with the logic of postmodernism. He admits that there are oppressed people, but there is no functional method in which to account for the multiple ways, in fact, people are oppressed. He then asked, who gets to decide how and in what way equality is implemented? And that's the bloody thing. Peterson then elaborated on a solution akin to the notion of the logos mentioned above. This is my last extended quote from Peterson. Quote, you have to fractionate the oppressed all the way down to the individual. Well, that's what the West figured out. It's not an accident that the axiomatic Western individual was someone who was unfairly nailed to a cross and tortured. So what do you do about that? Well, you don't get together in a damn mob. All that allows for you to do is be as horrible as you can imagine and suffer none of the consequences. That's a bad idea. Well, there's a deep idea in the West. It's like pick up your damn suffering and bear it, and try to be a good person so you don't make it worse. Well, what do you do about that? You accept it. And that's what's under assault by the postmodernist, end quote. So, I mean, I think as Emily mentioned earlier, I have no problem with, stand up straight with your shoulders back, tell the truth. That's benign advice, so to say, but it's here within Peterson's self-help mantra of sorting yourself out that a reactionary narrative manifests. He condemns ideas of collective action for social transformation as being nothing more than the assembly of a mob that allows for unfettered behaviors in service of postmodernists bent upon undermining Western civilization. So in my home state of South Carolina, we're organizing around Medicaid expansion, which would provide health care for 200,000 of our most vulnerable citizens. I'm not doing this. We're not doing this because we care about people's health. We want to undermine Western civilization. Keep that in mind. So to return to a 2018 interview with Rebel Wisdom, Peterson, reportedly following Jung, posits that the dominance hierarchy, along with the logos, is an essential aspect of the masculine archetype. The question then arises, how does Peterson come to conceptualize the dominance hierarchy and thereby the masculine archetype as the preeminent ordering principle of social organization? Before turning to Peterson's answer to this question, I have a question of my own. Why is it easier to imagine the death and resurrection of Big Papa than any modest change to our mode of economic organization? The meaning of maps, the belief of an architecture, is the title of this section. The epigraph is from the poet, one of my favorites, Christopher Wallace. Quote, I love it when you call me Big Papa, end quote. Peterson's interpretive schemas, his maps as it were, are precisely what he claims to organize the individual's competing internal psychophysiological demands in the context of a specific social formation. According to Peterson, these demands produce behaviors and values that must be rank ordered in accordance to the potentiality for their future consequences for the individual and others. This hierarchy of values is developed through a mutually reciprocal relationship between the individual and the larger social formation. The production of a hierarchy of values through mutually reciprocal relationship is deemed by Peterson as a battle for predominance, a battle which occurs intrapsychically, intersubjectively, and between the two. Peterson posits that it is the capacity to symbolically capitulate and symbolically destroy that provides the basis for human animals to organize themselves into groups. Animals, Peterson claims, can also lose face in a competition for dominance. They can be symbolically destroyed. Their loss is demonstrated in behavioral routines as opposed to the abstraction of argumentation. The outcome, however, is the same for Top Lobster as it is for Big Papa, dominance of the hierarchy. A hierarchy, which in Peterson's perspective is not only natural, but necessary for the organization of social groups. And for the clinicians in the audience, particularly when my patient says there's something natural or necessary, the logic of suspicion should always be deployed. Why is this natural? Why is this necessary? So this being said, for Peterson, if the individual does not have something of value with which to aim within the dominance hierarchy, in order to transcend suffering and ascend, thereby accruing greater resources, elevated social status, etc., the suffering of life would be unbearable, and the inevitable leveling of the hierarchy would leave the individual devoid of any meaningful pursuits. So I want to conceptualize Peterson's process, or pattern of interpersonal and intrapsychic struggle. He gives it for, quote, "The pattern is the corporeal ideal of the culture, its mode of transforming the unbearable present into the desired future, its guiding force, its central personality. This personality expressed in behavior is first embodied in the king or the emperor, socially where it forms the basis for sovereignty," end quote. The king, father, Big Papa, functions as the embodied ego ideal of culture, the ordering principle and therapeutic endorsement of a master signifier, predominant idea that guides and centralizes, organizing the battery of signifiers or ideas operating within a given social discourse. This ideal guides the individual in transcending and elevating one's status within the dominance hierarchy. Peterson, like Freud before him, posits that this cultural character or primordial father is transmitted through via various unconscious mechanisms, institutions, behaviors, and so on. This culturally determined structure, Peterson writes, this inhibitory network, this intrapsychic representative of the social unit, provides experiential phenomena with determinate significance, end quote. As we shall see, the determinate significance or circumscription of meaning provided by a cultural ego ideal masquerading as the Great Father organizes the illusory consistency of the big other, our social institutions and so on. In other words, Peterson's naturally occurring interpretive schemas, or maps of meaning, are imbued with the metaphysics of paternal presence. This functional presence not only provides an organizing principle, but in doing so it also covers over the inconsistencies and antagonisms of a given social formation. It is with a degree of cunning that the Great Father manifests itself as the corporeal ideal of culture. This section is called A Game of Social Cunning. It would only be Lacan who would liberate psychoanalysis from this neurotic solution through his discourse theory. However, Verhagen observes that Lacan does not get off the hook so easily, at least in terms of his earlier edible theory. Lacan falls prey to Freud's mythic reasoning and elevates the father as a solution to the threatening real of the mother, as does Peterson when he posits, quote, "The Great Father as wise king keeps one foot on the terrible mother, keeps the monsters of chaos locked up in his dungeon, or banished to the nether regions of the kingdom," end quote. However, in his later seminars, Lacan argues that threat of jouissance, this is a type of enjoyment that can become threatening because it transcends a certain limit or principle that threatens the subject's identity. So the antagonism emerges from the subject's own being. The displacement of this inherent impasse of the subject onto the other is eloquently summarized by Verhagen, quote, "From the point of the introduction of the other signs onward, the original internal division and internal impossibility can be externalized onto the other. It is she who carries with her the enjoyment. In her, with the result that it is her the demand will be addressed and upon whom the prohibition must be placed," end quote. In the game of social cunning, it is the father who protects the child from the threatening jaws of the crocodile, aka Big Mama. It is at this point Lacan unmasks the primordial father, or rather opens his sepulchre. Quote from Lacan, "No doubt a corpse is a signifier, but Moses' tomb was as empty for Freud as Christ was for Hegel," end quote. So what the hell is Lacan saying here? The people are not only deprived of Moses, but also of the primordial father. The Freudian dead father's tomb is empty because he was never there in the first place, but there remains a corpse, a signifier operating as a function. In Seminar 17, The Other Side of Psychoanalysis, Lacan confirms that the father of the primordial horde is simply a structural operator, a function, fiction of our imagination. Albeit the father of the primordial horde does not exist, he exists, that he persists in the unconscious of the subject while never being completely integrated into our social symbolic order. The biological father can never coincide with the function of the dead father as structural operator. The primordial father has to be dead in order to execute his function, which is precisely that of symbolic castration. So when we flesh out some of this Lacanian jargon, this is simply the separation of the child from the imaginary fusion with the other, or the mother. The real dead father is simply an agent for the discourse of the master, a pawn in what Lacan designates as social cunning, the function that introduces the master, signifier, the preeminent idea, which conceals the fundamental division of the subject. Peterson's great father serves the same function as Freud's, to conceal the fundamental division in the lack of the big other, in order to maintain a homeostatic mode of organizing the constellation of signifiers for the distribution of surplus jouissance. Or we can use this ideologically, in order to maintain a mode of economy, ideologically speaking, the distribution of surplus value. The corporeal ideal of culture, or to put it in Lacanese, the structural operator within social cunning, organizes and distributes psychophysiological demands in a way to produce a particular mode of subjectivity, and also ideologically reinforces the relations of production by concealing or repressing, negating the lack or antagonisms in the subject and a given mode of production, the problems of jouissance and class struggle, respectively. Therefore, the ordering of values that occurs intrapsychically and intersubjectively, which organize social groups and thereby produce what Peterson says are naturally occurring dominance hierarchies, are actually the results of a complex interplay between social links and modes of production. Last session, we're coming to an end here. Diagnosis and destitution of social links. For an appropriate diagnostic intervention, turn to a crazy person, the Maoist Platonist, Alain Badiou. Woo! Badiou offers a substantial assessment of modern subjectivity. In The True Life, he examines the weakened position of the father via the contemporary fate of boys. In a reversal of Freud's myth, it is the father who, in a culture of narcissism which adulates youthful countenance, envies the son's access to enjoyment, and whose symbolic position as the representative of the social law is debilitated by the singular law of modernity, market exchange, which is characterized, Badiou writes, quote, by equating everything with everything else, by being an anonymous law, with the result that the figure of the father has been cut off from it, and any control of the sons is itself asymbolic, end quote. The subtraction of the symbolic father as a constitutive figure of social initiation in particular institutions, for example, compulsory military service, renders what Badiou designates as a fatherless horde, a horde or gang with murderous intentions without a social institution to facilitate the symbolic reconciliation with the father, in order to end, in a Girardian way, the mimetic violence between brothers resulting in a symbolic pact. However, in the negative reality known as modernity, this dialectic has been torn asunder by the anonymous laws of the market. Badiou notes that the constitutive figures of the dialectic, father and son, remain active in this negative reality. However, the aforementioned anonymous law separates the figures from any meaningful symbolic pact. In the absence of any foundational act, the aggressivity of the sons remains caught in a perpetual repetition, known as the Freudian death drive. There is, however, what Badiou calls an initiation without an initiation, that offers three alternatives for marking the body in the absence of a foundational institution. So I'm going to go through these quickly. He initiates the three typologies of an initiation without an initiation with a perverted body. So the perverted body is constituted by a semblance of rituals which would initiate young people into adulthood. So the use of psychoactive substances, tattooing, music, competitive war rituals, etc. All of these occur in modernity in the absence of any collective narrative to make them meaningful. So the perverted body pursues these once initiatic rituals as forms of seeking pleasure. And I think this is adjacent to Fisher's concept of depressive hedonia. So we all know depression is characterized the inability to get pleasure. Fisher's notion of depressive hedonia is the inability to do anything else except for pursue pleasure. The next is the reactionary position, the sacrificed body, which is in fact a reaction to the perverted body. Now this is akin to the fundamentalists we were discussing earlier, insofar it's the mission of the fundamentalists to reinstall the Father, to reinstall the traditional hierarchies of ages long ago. And finally, the modern position. This is the deserving body, which Badiou takes from Sarkozy's speech about the deserving young people of France. This is the body that submits itself, quote, to the only acceptable law, that of the general equivalent, as Marx called it long ago. The deserving body positions itself on the market at the best price, end quote. This triad of the contemporary fate of boys specifically constitutes an asubjective position Badiou describes as, quote, a becoming subject wholly subservient to the circulation of commodities, and the sterile communication of signs and images is imposed on individuals who are vulnerable, conformist, as everyone is at that age, end quote. In reference to the Peterson phenomenon and the young white men who constitute his primary followers, along with other social groups or youth hordes such as the Proud Boys, seem to form a weird mixture of the aforementioned deserving body and sacrifice body, a body which seeks to adhere to a commodified asubjectivity, and at the same time reinstall the position of the primordial father as the representative and justification of traditional values in a pursuit to maintain the dominance hierarchy, the prevailing mode of production. As Gramsci observed, or at least in so much as this observation is attributed to Gramsci, when the old world is dying, new morbid symptoms or monsters appear. This strange, variegated body is a symptom of the contradictions of capital. The appeal to tradition and the position of the primordial father are attempts to attenuate the antagonisms of capital in effort to maintain its not-so-smooth functioning. Surely our desperate sorcerer is no longer in control of what is summoned from the netherworld. Badiou posits a resolution to the above-mentioned asubjective positions that corresponds to his four categories of truth events: what love, politics, art, and science. All of these truth events presuppose a social and or economic transformation, and each event in relationship to a specific body requires a break with the predominant asubjective position. The lack or antagonism at the center of this asubjective position must be reincorporated and transformed. Properly established, the break from this asubjective position will correspond to what our favorite Slovenian calls an untying of social links. This untying energy being constituted by what Freud called the death drive, or Hegel called abstract negativity, thus allowing for the untying of links to be rebound by an emancipatory collective. Zizek describes this untying movement as, quote, a zero level that opens up a space for a political intervention. In other words, this untying is the pre-political condition of politics, and with regard to it, every political intervention probably already goes one step too far, committing itself to a new project, or master signifier, end quote. However, a form of subjective destitution must occur with this untying, whereby the lack in the big other is acknowledged. How is this to be done? Hell, I don't know, but I'll give you a suggestion. The psychoanalyst strives to evoke truth and thereby subjective change through punctuating, cutting, and interpreting the analysand speech, allowing pathological elements to fall away and new meanings to form, elevating the analysand speech to the unconscious signifying chain and en route to encounter the signifier of the lack of the other. In terms of the aforementioned truth events, the lack of a signifier that would function as a guarantee of these events must be recognized and incorporated into the subject and the event itself. There is no big other to render existential assurance for an event. The subject is destitute. We're alone. So we have to get rid of the old Marxist idea that we're on the train of history, we're on the right side of history, the moral arc of the universe bends towards justice. There's no guarantee for our political interventions. I think this is something that we have to recognize. Peterson is correct insofar as a set of values provide an essential meaning and engender a specific understanding of our lives and relations with others. Does this conclusion presuppose a hierarchy in which, for example, the surplus value, the profit, produced by the vast majority of people is appropriated by a minority? In the wake of growing wealth disparities, new forms of racial and class apartheid, impending ecological catastrophe, and finally the crisis for the meaning of the subject, I do not think it does. As old and new meanings remain perpetually destabilized, and I'm going to say it because it's been said too many times, All that is solid melts into thin air by capitalist realism. What's left of the left will have to struggle to offer an alternative to Peterson's attempt to attenuate its inconsistencies and contradictions, against which his neurotic solution is ironically a protest. Thank you. I hope you're not too bored. Ride on, fight on, power to the people.
Have you ever read Genevieve Malcao? Oh my god, she's my favorite analyst right now. So what's really super cool about her is that, unlike Zizek, and this is where I really don't like Zizek, is where she focuses specifically on Seminar 23, like concept of the Santoma. So rather than talking about like subjective destitution, oh like, you know, like accept that you like don't exist or whatever, like whatever. I feel like what's really cool about her is that Zizek talks about in this book, which is not translated into English, but it's coming out in November 22nd, check it out, Law of the Mother, Essay on the Sexual Santome, oh my god. What she talks about is basically like, okay, so we are thrown into our like fucking like family or whatever, right? Specifically, whatever our caretaker, our big other in childhood, that's the law of the mother, right? And we get sucked into that, our subjectivity is sucked into that. The question is, how do we get out of it, right? Well, on the one, like, you know, sort of traditional patriarchal answer, name of the father, paternal signifier, all that stuff, she advocates following the later Kant, Seminar 23, talks about the santome. The santome is like a synthesized symptom, blah, blah, blah. And specifically the sexual santome, the sort of sexual self-definition, the binal interiority, the construction of a sort of like synthesized symptomatic self that is, in a certain sense, moving beyond total subjection to the law of the mother and actually sort of actualizes the subject. I mean, this is similar to like Badiou's theory of the subject as outplaced and theory of the subject, that kind of stuff. And I see this as basically an affirmative, a positive step, right? And what else was I going to say about this? I do think though that there's another dimension of it where there does have to be, and like Subcon talks about this, especially with like James Joyce as the example of the santome, there is a little bit of social externalization. There is a little bit of like this question of like reputation, connection with other people. And that also gets really complicated and gets into lots of like questions about like, oh, like acting out, like familial dynamics, acting out patriarchal abuse, that kind of thing. But in general, I think that this thread of the santome is much more promising, much more interesting, and has much more of a future than the kind of Zizekian negativity fetish, which I've been trying to call into question, and I think I would really like to have a conversation about where Zizek is departing from Lacan's later insights, and like how that relates to this question of what can replace the paternal signifier in the future.
Thank you, I'm not sure how to respond. Certainly, I'll just say I want to put this in an accessible way, is that I do think there's going to have to be, I think there's a terminology from farming. Clear the land, there's going to have to be a burning, so to speak. So with the untying of social needs, I do think our current social institutions, the way we relate to one another, etc., there's going to have to be an untying or an undoing and a rethinking of this. And I think Badiou articulates this. And this is the point of the New Symbolization Project, from my understanding. How do we symbolize a new egalitarian free form of relating to each other, as opposed to being dictated to by capital, patriarchy, etc. I don't know quite how we're going to do that, but I think it's essential we start rethinking this, because I think the good thing about capital that Marx commends is that it's clearing all of these old traditions out of the way. And if they're still there, they operate under suspicion. And so I think part of our task in our practical organizing is to modify the way we relate to each other in our communities. And so perhaps it's a poor prescription, that's what comes to mind.
Push that a little bit. I mean, having, lost the father archetype and so on. Surely the answer is not to cast around looking for some other archetype to glom onto. But yet it seems like that's what human beings tend to do. So how would you address that from a standpoint of psychoanalysis? Is it possible for us to order our social relationships and social frameworks and so on without simply being tied to an archetype?
Well, I mean, it's a good question. I don't know if I can answer for it, but I mean, as a Lacanian, I question the notion of archetypes. I think there's some truth to it. Freud called them archaic vestiges. And what I like what Lacan does later on is that these archetypes they do not naturally arise, so to speak. they're products of social cunning, of a game which attributes power to certain individuals within our society, such as the father, potestas patrias, familias. Comes from an economic mode of relations, an ideology. And so I think it's internalized in the unconscious. Perhaps it's like the use of death, or perhaps it's deeply seated in our unconscious and our mode of being. But I do think it is predicated on social manipulation to reinforce certain material conditions, put in the Marxist jargon. And there are conservative Lacanians who argue that there is no getting away from the father, that this is the preeminent mode, this is the only way of organizing society. But I think in a deeply Christian tradition, particularly with the Holy Spirit as a community of believers, it's if you don't hate your mother, your father, the existing social order, you're not a follower of mine. And so I adhere to that tradition. I don't know if there's a possibility for escaping from Big Papa, but I'm hoping we can relate to each other in a more equitable way.
Okay, this might be a little weird, but I'm gonna just try to like weave around the thing. Okay, the thing with the empty tomb is really fascinating. And for Freud, the tomb is already empty. Yesterday, Andrew Woods had a thing about how, if we were going to exhume the body of the Enlightenment, that it's actually a sort of cobbled together corpse made of like it's like a straw man. It's a figure that didn't exist to begin with. And he uses Stephen Hicks, who wrote Petersons cites throughout his books, as a person who kind of cobbled together this myth of the Enlightenment and I wonder, I just wonder about that, like the recurrence of the image of that, the empty tomb and the emptiness of like that maybe that ideal was never there to begin with. And then I started to think about like how, just like the way biological conception and birth works is that something comes out of the father into the body being stored inside the body of the mother. And so you have an intimate, you were baked in the womb of the mother, if you're going to essentialize that way, but I think a lot of these images kind of deal in those terms. That there's a fundamental absence of involvement that we sort of try to make up for in certain ways, right?
Can you say more about that?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I feel like I was a psychology major undergrad, and I always saw penis envy as sort of like a projected woman being, right? The idea that you were physically part of another person and it wasn't your father. So what does that mean for psychological development? Yeah.
So I mean, just in terms of what comes to mind is Freud was in correspondence with a mystic. I think this is at the beginning of Das Unterhalten Kultur. And the mystic is describing his experience of when he's meditating, there's an oceanic feeling which washes over him. And so, I mean, Freud being a reductionist, he's like, oh, this is your desire to return to the womb. And I mean, from Dr. Walton's talk yesterday, that we're always pursuing that lost object, that imaginary fusion that we had with the other. Because even though biologically we were a part of that body, it was something that was doomed for separation ultimately. And so that being said, I mean, what comes to mind for me, what do we do with this psychological tendency or propensity in this pursuit of the lost object? And I think, Peter, you were touching on this. Some type of ethical, political project, and relating, and then it's become popular to otherize, not popular to do as much, but that's a way to describe a form of racism and so on. And I do think we should otherize, insofar as, let's say, I otherize you, Peter, in the sense that if I reduce you to my experiences, that's an unethical act, because it's imaginary. I'm viewing you as my fantasy of you, instead of the radical other that you are. And so perhaps it's a loose connection, but I'm wondering if we can connect the drive for the lost object and otherizing the other in a positive sense, insofar this drive is circumvented, redirected.
Okay.
Yeah, sublimated.
I think I just
psychoanalytic.
figured out the other part of what I wanted to say, which is that in Numa Unleashed, Apsu gets killed first, right? And because he's trying to kill his children. And then actually, Ia doesn't really, first he suspends him in his sleep, and he puts him in this like weird like carbonite like Han Solo, and then he he and his wife conceive Marduk in the tomb. And so I didn't mention this in the paper because I was editing for length, but in pure Apsu is how Marduk was conceived. In other words, he's like purely of the substance of the Father, and that's like a theological thing that comes through in Christianity too. Like like the Mary is this sort of like inert vessel, but the like being and substance of the Father is the thing that like comes, that's like the thread that comes through. Sorry, I lost one other train of thought. But there's my friend who was like in a new media sort of art program. It was very experimental about 10 years ago, where basically it was she basically like couldn't deal with, or was like kind of eventually felt driven out of it, because it was like it felt like the creative space of technology was overtaken by sort of like men wanting to recreate a womb, like an ex machina kind of thing, like, and like maybe even like the image of like a creator deity that's a man is like the man taking over the father taking over the process of creation. Usurping the process of creation from the actual like natural processes of creation. Yeah.
So here's the thing about that for me is that it's more of phallus envy, and this is something I love about the Khan's, the idea of the phallic signifier, that it's like the actual physical penis is just one, it's a privileged one, but it's one manifestation of the same sort of like imaginary signifier of like unity of the self and power and capability. And I think that, insofar as like the penis is a representation of that, it's like, like the big dick or whatever. Big dick energy, literally big dick energy is how we talk about that colloquially. It's sort of like what people are after is like, in a big way, people who are like trying to like do some kind of social disruption. And I think that this is not a categorically negative thing. It's like some kind of phallic, like some kind of like phallic identity. Daniel Caruso on my live stream was just talking about it sort of like a magic wand. I think that's very apt. That idea of phallus is kind of this idea of a magic wand. I think it's interesting when you look at like witches, like witch signifiers. Everybody watched the anime Little Witch Academia. It has like all this crazy phallic symbolism. But my favorite, like think about the brooms, right? Brooms, like and literally the history of like brooms and like the sexualization of that. Anyway, that's where I would go with that stuff.
No, yeah, it just seems like a lot of symbolizing of actually occurring processes.
Mm-hmm.
No, certainly.
Yeah, but like, yeah.
I was just going to say, those processes, I think they are limited in terms of their psychological satisfaction, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I think on both sides, let's say mother and father, there is still a striving for completeness, even if, the case in this traditional way of thinking about the joy of motherhood and so on, even if that's actualized by the physical process, it's still lacking. There'll still be an incompleteness which is inherent to that process, because we're always striving for this enjoyment, this completeness, which is an impossibility in one respect. As a liberal snowflake, I will be triggered and offended if I do not receive some criticism. So I'll give you some criticism. Okay, I'll give you. That would be facetious. That's it. I really appreciate your attention. I hope you were not too bored.